The purpose of Psalm 3 is in part to give us a case study of Psalm 2, where people have risen up against God's anointed King David. And yet God delivers David and saves him from all of his enemies. And in saving David, the king, God is actually saving the people, because the people will be blessed by David's reign. That's why verse 8 ends with, "Your blessing be upon your people." It connects back to verse 12 of chapter 2, or of Psalm 2, where he says, "How blessed are all who take refuge in him." So in God saving and blessing the king, he's saving and blessing his people. Now notice there's a title or superscription before verse 1. It says, "A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son." I think we should take those titles seriously, because either they were written by the original inspired author, or they were written in by the prophets who were inspired and later organized and put the Psalms together in the current order that we have them. And this gives us some context, which you can read about in 2 Samuel 15 through 18, where David's own son betrays him and usurps the throne, and David is forced to leave his kingdom and to walk with his head held low, weeping as he goes out into the wilderness. And yet, despite losing everything, he still trusts the Lord to save him. And he can go to sleep at night, surrounded by death, surrounded by people who want to kill him. And yet, in verse 5, he wakes the next day because God kept him safe. And God will bring him safely through this trial. As far as practice goes, I like how one writer put it, that we need to relocate our glory in God. Many times our glory, our sense of worth and importance and security are found in our possessions and our positions. But if that's the case, what happens when we lose those things, like David did here? I mean, David, he's a king, and a king found his glory in his kingdom, in his throne, in his power, in his military might. David has lost all of those things. He's been totally stripped of all of his earthly glory. And yet he says in verse 3, "You, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory. You are my glory, and the one who lifts my head." David's glory was found in God, not in his positions or possessions. And I'll tell you what makes this even more impressive, and something that we need to practice as well. David knew this was all happening because of his own sin. Everything that happens in 2 Samuel 15 to 18 was caused by his sin with Bathsheba back in 2 Samuel 11. Nathan prophesied that this would happen, that all of his household would fall apart essentially because of his sin. And yet, despite knowing he's being disciplined by God, he still knows God is with him. You know, when you're being disciplined by God or chastened for your behavior, sometimes it may feel like God has abandoned you and he's not with you anymore. But you know, God loves those whom he disciplines. And David knows God is still with him. God is going to save him. As far as prophecy goes, certainly Jesus too was stripped of all of his earthly glory on the cross. And yet God was his glory. God was his protector. He knew God was his salvation. And so Jesus, in a sense, could go to sleep. He could sleep the sleep of death and yet still awake 3 days later, because the Lord had sustained him and crushed and shattered all of his enemies, just like he said he would do in Psalm chapter 2. That's happening now in Psalm 3 in verse 7. Same thing happens with Jesus. And because God saved Jesus and protected our King, he ended up saving us. And we are now blessed because of God's salvation of our great King. And you know, many people on the cross were mocking Jesus and saying, you know, basically God's not with you. And if you're really God's son, you know, you just come off the cross. But Jesus didn't allow the mockery of the crowds to sway him. He also realized he was bearing the discipline of our sin upon himself. He wasn't being disciplined for his own sin, but for ours. And yet God saved him, and his salvation is our salvation. His blessing is our blessing. And that is worth praising God for. And it's also worth praying to God, Father, help me to relocate my glory in you, to not put all my importance and worth and security in earthly things that I can lose at any moment, but to trust in you when I've lost everything, because you are everything to me.